So this is a talk just to give some introductory material or the basics of running by Jeff Hauk from George Fox University. So the objectives are to discuss spatiotemporal variables associated with walking, running, and sprinting, describe some of the EMG patterns associated with running, and compare and contrast walking, running, and sprinting kinematics or angles and kinetics or hip powers and moments to get an idea of how the muscles are functioning across a running cycle. And then discuss how running speeds are achieved with special reference to stride length, cadence, and muscle function, and then briefly discuss foot strike patterns and frontal plane movement during a running cycle. So let's start with spatiotemporal measures. And here we see in the blue stance phase and the white swing phase for walking, 60-40 split approximately with a period of double support here. We contrast that with different running speeds from a recreational to a sprint to an elite sprint. We can see that we see this progressive increase in the swing phase in the white here and decrease in the stance phase or the blue to where it becomes very, very brief, approximately 20% of an elite sprint. So what this can tell us is that to achieve that very rapid speed, we need some rapid production of force in a very, very brief period as we try to go faster. So here's the hip angle patterns, and we have a graph here that's supplied to us by Novacek et al. From 1990s, and really a classic paper where they compared all three of these activities, walking, running at a recreational speed, and a sprint. And we see the red here is walking, the dark line is the recreational running speed, and the dotted line is sprint. And we have heel strike here, and then the subsequent heel strike. This is your end of the running stance phase. Then we have hip, knee, and ankle, all flexion extension graphs. So we can make some observations across these graphs where we know running requires greater hip flexion early and greater hip flexion during swing, peaking in the 45-degree range for the swing phase. And at knee flexion, we can see that across the entire cycle, there's just more knee flexion. So stances upwards of 50-ish degrees, and then into the 100 degrees during the swing phase. For the ankle, there's a much greater dorsiflexion during the normal running here. So if we compare about 10 to 15 degrees during a gait cycle, we need upwards of 30 degrees during a recreational run. And what's interesting here is that it's markedly different for a sprint. And we can see that as we move to sprinting, there's less dorsiflexion, kind of more comparable to walking, but the amount of plantar flexion is dramatically increased, where we're upwards of 30 to greater amounts of plantar flexion are needed at toe off. So in this graphic, we look at the moments and powers, the moments being on the top row, the joint powers being on the bottom row, at the hip and in the middle of the knee, and then to the right, the ankle. And again, we have the red is walking, the solid line is running, and then the dotted line sprinting. And this allows us to compare the overall contribution of different muscles at these different speeds. And so if we look here, what's important to note is that the landing strategy at the hip is concentric. So that's the first thing that jumps out at us. We have this power generation that's occurring during the first half of the stance phase, which we're going to call the braking kind of half. And then during the propulsion half, here to the right, we see that the hip flexors now are the major contributors. And it's much greater than the peak that we would see for walking. And then as we go to sprinting, it even increases more. And when we look at the power, the overall contribution of that muscle is really evident, where the negative power that's associated with the hip here during the second part of the stance phase or the propulsion component at the hip is progressively higher as we increase speed. And then as we look at the early swing phase, we see the same thing happening where we have a much greater power generation at a sprinting speed than even a running speed. So to review for the hip, we have a concentric hip extension early, eccentric hip flexion at propulsion, and then a large concentric hip flexion during faster running. And so at the knee, we see again the same when we compare to walking, much larger knee extension contributions here, but interestingly a slight decrease at the moment as we go to faster speeds. And then we look at the power, it's kind of a wash. We have that initial eccentric knee extension absorption that occurs during the braking phase, and then a similar knee power generation during the propulsion phase. So the knee power generation during the propulsion phase is not progressively increased though with faster speeds. And then just some modulation of the knee flexion that's going on by the knee extensors, and that's mostly eccentric. So now we look at the ankle, and the first thing we can notice is there's a much larger load than walking, which is not surprising. And we see some earlier and increase with sprinting, but it's not proportional to the speed. And we see here again the same thing in the power, where there's this early absorption that's going on during the braking phase, and then a power generation here during the propulsion phase that does increase some with increasing speed to a sprinting. So we can kind of confirm that with the EMG data, and so this is from the same paper by Novacek in 1998, and we can look here in this review, they're identifying the different muscles, the hamstrings, hip extensors, quadriceps, and anterior tib. We can see here's initial contact, and at the initial contact point we have this kind of large increase in timing of muscles, and it's off near the toe-off component, and then we can see that there's some pre-activation during swing, okay, and then as we go to that subsequent initial contact, we have, again, a large increase in EMG activity to handle the landing mechanics. So in summary, muscle function during the absorption or braking phase is we have concentric hip extensors, followed by and eccentric knee extensors, and at the ankle, it depends somewhat on the heel strike pattern, but a majority of people are a initial heel contact, and they would have eccentric dorsiflexion activation, and then we would have, for the forefoot landing, we'd have an eccentric plantar flexion contribution. So during the propulsion phase, though, a lot of the roles switch. We have, instead of concentric hip extensors, we have eccentric hip flexors, and then at the knee, we have concentric knee extensors, and then at the ankle, concentric plantar flexion. But during early swing, the hip roll is increasing at higher speeds, and we have this concentric hip flexion that's occurring that's important to increase speeds. The eccentric knee extension, which seems to remain fairly constant, and then concentric dorsiflexion to help clear the limb. And then during late swing, we have concentric hip extension and eccentric knee flexion. And another look at the positive work as it's being distributed across different speeds. We see here during walking the really phenomenal result where if this pie chart shows the distribution at the hip, knee, and the different positive work done at each joint, and here's the ankle, and the hash marks is the contribution of the ankle, which is nearly over 50% of all the different joints that contribute, meaning the ankle's contributing a major amount of the positive work needed to move the trunk forward. And as we look at that same hashed region, we notice that it decreases as we go to higher speeds. So its proportion of the overall work done is decreasing to where when we get to the sprinting speeds, it's only producing 34%. And now if we look at the hip contribution and we start at the slower speed again, we can see, well, it's giving a fair amount, like 37% or so when we look at the hip flexors and extensors here and a small amount from hip abduction. And then as we kind of go to faster speeds, the ratios switch. So now we go up to the fastest speed. Well, the hip is now accounting for over half the positive work that's done during a sprinting task. So the second part of this is asking the question, okay, so there's two real strategies to increasing speed, and this is done by an article in JOSPT that was recently published. These graphs are taken from that paper. And essentially the question is posed there is, how does a person increase speed? There's the two strategies include pushing harder on the ground or making your foot cycle more frequently. And so we have here the stride length is kind of a measure of the strategy of pushing harder, so you get a bigger stride, and then the stride frequency is that rate variable. And it's very interesting that essentially if we look at just stride length or pushing harder, as we go as we increase from a slower to a moderate speed, the strategy is all about increasing stride length. We have 30% increases in stride length. But as we get to faster speeds, this is really illustrated by the top speed here, there's less flexibility in stride length, and so that's not our strategy. But if we look at the frequency, if we're at slower speeds, the frequency stays fairly constant, and then until we get to the highest speeds, that's when we see our largest increases in frequency. And so stride length and frequency kind of interact to generate these different changes in speed. And there's the author of the JOSPT article that these studies or graphs are taken from. And so this graph here is insightful in terms of the role of the muscles during gait in terms of support, the top row or vertical ground reaction force relative to these different speeds, and then the braking forces and propulsion forces here on the bottom row. And so the blue line is the contribution of the gastroc to these different ground reaction forces, and the dotted orange line is the contribution of the quadricep muscle. And what we can see here is that the quadricep muscle is accounting for greater and greater amounts of the vertical ground reaction force as we increase speed, to where at the end the peak force is nearly 60-70% of the total of the ground reaction force, meaning that the gastroc muscles are really critical in terms of supporting the vertical position of the trunk. And if we look at take the same logic and apply it to the anterior-posterior or braking and propulsive forces here, where the braking forces are these negative forces and the propulsive forces are these positive forces here, we can see they progressively increase with speed, and that the gastroc in blue almost entirely accounts for the propulsive force in each case, and that the quadricep muscle is negative or braking in each case. And so the gist is that there's a trade-off in terms of what the muscles do to kind of balance the trunk, but the key role of the plantar flexors can't be emphasized. So as we move in this article, it does a really nice job of pointing out the differing roles of the ankle plantar flexors and hip muscles as we change speed, and we're going to review that here. And so to illustrate the role of the ankle plantar flexors, we're going to start by discussing the EMG patterns and then contrast that with the energy produced, which isn't shown. But it wouldn't surprise us as we look at the different speeds shown here and then the normalized EMG here on the x-axis, where one is full activation, and we can see the activation progressively increases, only achieving around a 60% activation at this fairly high speed. When we go to really high speed, we get to absolute full activation and 53% increase from the previous 6.9 meters per second. Well, what's interesting is you would think, okay, so there's a lot more contribution of the gastroc muscle itself in creating energy here. But essentially, if we look at the energy data, there's almost no increase in energy contribution here from the gastroc muscle. And so the idea is that basically as we go from this moderately fast to very fast speed, what's happening is the velocity, shortening velocity of the muscle is topped out, so it can't achieve higher shortening velocities. So essentially it has to tap into some of just the natural strain elasticity that's the Achilles tendon is able to return to the task. So when we have an eccentric followed by a concentric contraction, the recoil of the tendon can actually move faster than the muscle belly itself. And so the strategy of the gastroc seems to be to take advantage of that strain elasticity to increase higher speeds. So where this becomes important clinically is the strain elastic energy of the gastroc muscle is accounting for the energy generated during running at most of these speeds, anywhere from 50 to 70%. And so it may impact how we rehab people, and it may be influencing the epidemiology of the disease as well. So as we look at the hip and contrast that with the ankle, so what we're noticing is that at faster and faster speeds, the ankle becomes less able to produce the output we need to achieve a higher speed. And so the body then turns to another approach, and that approach is as at the hip, where the hip flexion power generations increase significantly, and if we tally the work, the positive and negative work at the different speeds, we see as a logarithmic increase in the work done at the hip at faster speeds, meaning that as we get faster and faster, we're more likely to load and have high demands at the hip, in addition to the ankle plantar flexion group. So another question to ask is there flexibility in rate or stride length at a common speed? And so this was done in a paper by Heiderscheit et al. In 2011, which has been widely published and discussed. And so what we see here is changing stride rate when speed is held constant. So here's the preferred rate, and then frequencies increased 5 and 10% or decreased 5 and 10%. So essentially we have the bigger strides here to the left, and then the shorter strides here to the right. And the braking work or negative work, and it's labeled here energy absorbed, is shown on the top, and then the propulsion work is shown on the bottom. And we can see is that at higher strides or lower rates, there's much greater work, negative and positive work done on the different joints. So the black is the ankle, the shaded is the knee, and the white is the hip. And then as we increase rate, what we can see is that there is a decreasing load at the knee for braking, and then the same load at the ankle. And then across all the different strides, we see for propulsion, we see a gradually decreasing load at the ankle and also at the knee. So this gives us some ideas when we're not topped out or constrained by running at maximum speeds, that there's some flexibility in either increasing stride or frequency to accomplish the moderate levels of speed. And so here we're going to evaluate a foot stride pattern. So we can kind of look at a running stride here. You can see that there's a definite heel strike with some deformation of the shoe. And this is the typical kind of ground reaction force pattern that's associated with a heel strike, most often wearing a shoe. And we see this rapid increase and spike in the early ground reaction force during the braking phase. So there's this high rate of loading, which leads to increased knee braking forces and an initial ankle dorsiflexion moment. So we contrast that with this person here, who's more of a midfoot striker, And we can see them landing there with an initial contact at the midfoot. And this might be their ground reaction force pattern where we lose that initial high rate of loading and spike, and instead the plantar flexors are lowering the heel to the ground. And so these significant changes in braking forces, but doesn't affect the propulsion phase. So there's some discussion of this because essentially when some people did studies with habitually barefoot runners, they found that they mostly did heel strike patterns compared to long distance runners who wore shoes. But it should be recognized that as you increase speed, there's a tendency to move to a forefoot strike pattern. And essentially, if you look at sprinters, they're all going to be landing with forefoot strike patterns. So in review, speed is, we have high stride length and peak rate at increased speeds, greater hip flexion extension contributions, and a limited amount of ability of the plantar flexors to continue to be utilized to increase speed, and a high reliance on strain, return of strain energy from the Achilles tendon to achieve those speeds. And then step rate, as we increase step rate, there's strides are smaller, of course, and then we have lower knee energy for braking, and then some redistribution of loading at the ankle, where the ankle's also going down, and somewhat at the hip. So it's at increased rates, we have less overall energy per stride, but then we have to take more strides cumulatively to cover the same distance. And then initial contact patterns, we know a forefoot pattern, we're going to have greater ankle plantar flexion moments and powers, and then decreased ground reaction force rates loading throughout the limb. So finally, we're going to end with a discussion of subtalar joint motion during running, and this is mostly seen in the frontal plane. So here we have initial contact, and so now we're going to look at the subtalar joint during running. So we see the frontal plane motion. So we have initial contact to toe off for braking and propulsion here in yellow. So initially at 5 degrees of inversion, so that moves into rapid eversion. It kind of stabilizes there until you get into the propulsion phase, and then we have some amount of inversion again. And so the muscle actions that are associated with this at the ankle are the everters here at top, so the peroneus longus, and then the inverters are anterior tib and posterior tib here below. We can see that essentially, if we just think about braking phase, that's mostly about the anterior tib, and then during the propulsion phase, we have co-contraction between the peroneus longus and tibialis posterior muscles. And when the knee is straight, it's possible to take advantage of the effect of the rotation at the hip. And so it's also been shown that there's some proximal to distal energy flow where during the propulsion phase, because when the knee is straight, there's good transfer of the hip motion to the tibia. And so during this phase, at this point right here of inversion, it's also likely that the hip muscles help control that rotation that's causing the inversion. So here we can see the landing position here for the person that's a forefoot striker, and we can see their relatively neutral landing position. And then here the eversion that's occurring with a return to slight inversion, and then at push-off, they're fairly inverted. So that's all for now. Happy running, and hope that you continue to be curious and look into different mechanics of running on behalf of your patients.